This is it. The top 30 of the 90 dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV, from ARR to 6.5. If you have skipped ahead to this video, what are you even doing? Why are you doing it? I can only assume YouTube dropped it into your recommendations, but I've ranked the entire suite, so go back and listen, because we started at the bottom and now we're here. And also all the explanations for how I rank these is back there. And if you're being stubborn about it and insisting you're only here for the good stuff, let me attach a big spoiler warning here, especially. Anyway, I've been at this for a while now because I recorded all of these back to back, so I'm as eager as you probably are to get to the end of this list. So let's get rolling. Number 30. Bardam's Medal. Kicking off the top third of this list is a dungeon that people probably remember first and foremost for one specific part, the boss fight with Bardam, which is to say not so much as fight as it is a mechanics test. And whether you think the medal deserves this spot is entirely going to depend on how you feel about that segment. Some people hate it, but when it was released, there was a lot of jokes about taking new potential raid members there. Only one person needs to do the mechanics well enough to get through, and it's still embarrassing to screw up. Everybody will know you're bad. And I like that about it, and I like the fact that for once it just was willing to go in on some more complex patterns. It's a great exam and one of my favorite second bosses, favorite in Stormblood in fact. If you think differently and find it boring though, the medal still has a lot of solid stuff going in on it. Spicy trash with a little bit of flavor thanks to stuff like the Iron Ball traps. Garula is an okay boss with a lot of variability depending on what mobs you startle, and the Yawl is a decent, if not insanely impressive final boss. Plus, the dramatic version of the Steps theme accompanies you, and you get a fairly gorgeous set of vistas full of little details that add even more flair. I don't think the whole picture of this dungeon is necessarily insane, but I do think that its set-piece moment does pull the entire dungeon up with it in this case. It's a strong start to our top third. Sage says, now this is a placement that I feel like is in a good spot. My Song said, the first boss is underrated, I think. The mechanics are sort of hard to get, but I like the concept of the creatures of the step, and once you get the mechanic, it's interesting. Yeah, it is neat, I just don't think it's necessarily that intense. But Fire Lamplight said, yes, this is the Are You Paying Attention dungeon of Stormblood. Yep, this is the Hey, did you not upgrade your gear? Why not? 29. Dunmeg. A dungeon whose name I have almost certainly mispronounced. This isn't going to be everyone's favorite, and I get it. The Land of the Fae, though, is one that transforms around as you go. There's just such a great evolution from the floral garden to the overgrown forest, climbing up the trees, entering into the water palace after walking across the lake. The entire thing carries this sense of whimsy and mischief that is fitting for the fact that this is the forest dungeon. This is the fairy dungeon, is what I should have said. And you know what? The gameplay is honestly pretty fun. You get decently threatening trash for, it's a leveling dungeon. The first boss does bring Landblood to the table, a series of water explosions that are deceptively large and frequent and trip up lots of players, even ones who think they should be above this. Grial is not a super interesting fight, its one gimmick being pretty straightforward, but at the end we do get the Lord of the Longsome Gate, who I'm not going to try to say his given name, with his various spells of transformation, including transforming the arena into a fairly memorable and unique little tightrope segment. I hear if you take too long, he even turns himself back into a little frog. I'm proud to say I have never witnessed this with my own two eyes. I think Dunmeg does a generally great job of doing what it sets out to do, creating a journey through the games of the Fae. It stumbles some on its second boss, and yeah, its music is fitting, but a little bit underwhelming, and not exactly the most driving. And this specific aesthetic isn't going to match with everybody, and if it doesn't match with you, this probably would place significantly lower. But I think that its aesthetic is actually pretty unique among 14, and is done super well. Sage Storyteller said, can confirm, Tiny Frog, I've done enough trusts. I have not done enough trusts. Flex said, I honestly can't wait to see how the visual update will update this place. Oh, yeah. Aubert said, really nice aesthetics, and the water spouts and balance beams are call-out posts. Absolutely. 28. The Temple of the Fist. This is one of the Stormblood dungeons that really surprised me on revisiting it. I had largely forgotten this one, and it reminded me I shouldn't have. Are there weak points? Kind of. A pretty poor first boss in the curls, alright music theme, and not necessarily a great sense of anything too achieved on the identity front. Part of the reason you'll forget it, really. It's just alright on those. It's the rest that makes the temple shine. You get a great variety of vistas supporting you as you climb the ancient monk training ground. The trash is constantly making sure you're being bombarded with extra AoEs and keeping you on your toes, though I kind of wish you could get knocked off the cliffs. That would have been funny. There's 2 great bosses here, too. The records suggest you would have made a poor monk. Arbudo whooped the party I was with because one of the DPS went AFK right as we started, and I finally got to see him absolutely mocking us for our performance. And also, at the end, there's the Curl Fist himself. Maybe Stormblood's best dungeon boss? No, really, hear me out. He has a huge variety of mechanics, which usually come with some overlap to mix it up. They can't be ignored, even though the place is so outgeared. He's got so many you might not even see them all anymore. And while that's kind of sad, that variety honestly makes him an excellent boss fight in my eyes. Really stands out. I was very surprised by the temple when I revisited it. It's not quite excelling in some areas, but the places where it is are definitely enough to carry it up. Yoshi said, totally not monk biases. I mean, maybe a bit. Aubert said, no, this is way higher than I expect. Forgettable to me like Scala was mentioned earlier. Yeah, I'd forgotten this one too, and I expected overgearing it to hurt it way more than it actually did. 27. The Great Gooble Library. One of the most thematically memorable dungeons to come out of Heavensward. And it's Heavensward's 3rd best dungeon. Like, just look at this place. A massive abandoned library refilled by the denizens and demons of its tomes. That's such a good vibe. This is the forbidden section. It's all augmented by the incredibly memorable music track. Ink Long Dry is a piece that keeps breaking down and coming back together, improvising itself and trying to hold together. It complements the place so much, not just earning an award for my favorite audio in Heavensward, but also helping this place establish my favorite identity in Heavensward. Does the rest live up? I mean, if it did, it would place even higher. None of it is outright bad, mind you. Each of the bosses have their fun little gimmicks, though I think the current iteration of Demon Tone feels kind of like a letdown, and Bibliotaph no longer leaving the lingering AoEs to get in the way of doing his mechanics has weakened the place a little bit on the gameplay front, unfortunately. And the trash, even though it coming out of books is flavorful and stuff, it's not super great, it's just okay. And while the dungeon is super moody, the dark lighting does make it a little hard to appreciate certain aspects, so the hard mode does technically look better. But as you approach the end of Heavensward, Gooble feels like such a left turn into something fantastical that it's hard not to like it. It's this specific fantasy done so well. Love the demon book, actually. Love this dungeon so much. He does have FF5 bias. Yep. Yoshi said, inject this song into my veins. Yeah. Oh, and I didn't even mention the lore booklets that Cecil brought up. Yeah, just a nice little touch, too. Just so good. Oh, there's it. Depending on the people that would show up in the public library back in the day, the monsters here are an improvement. On that, 26. Snowcloak, 2.x's third best dungeon. This dungeon marked the point where they decided to start weaving dungeons back into the main story instead of having them all be optional, and so I guess they wanted to bring them back in with a bang, and they delivered. For being ARR, Snowcloak is a startlingly gorgeous dungeon. It's an ice cave, sure, but it makes a point to have each leg represent a different version of that fantasy. You fight the freezing Wandil in a traditional cavern, with his unique freezing mechanic. In the second leg, we go out onto the cliffs. We're buffeted by the icy winds and have to deal with the Yeti, who, now that he's reworked, is not a puzzle boss, but is also not a boss that will take you 10 million years if you run in with a bad party. And I don't mind his current iteration now. And of course, it's back into the more crystalline, like straight up ice section for the last leg, where we fight Fenrir, a boss who, by the way, will straight up still instant kill you if you try to ignore his mechanics. I didn't learn that from experience. You can't prove it. So each leg has a decent enough boss, great trash variety, solid visual variety, and it's accompanied by one of the most peaceful dungeon tracks in the game. But in the case of a Winter Wonderland dungeon, I think that fits solidly enough. Snowcloak's just an all-around really solid piece, which is wild for something that came out in freaking ARR. Like, these are the types of scores I would expect to be giving, like, Stormblood and Shadowbringers dungeons, and here we are. Aubert said, no, seriously, Hot Cocoa plus this music is a dangerous combo. Like, right now for me. A lot of people saying sleepies, but one person playing actually puts them to sleep as gameplay. Yeah, this might be a little too unexciting for some people, but I love Snowcloak and always have. 25. Matoya's Relict. I'd make a joke about Relict these nuts, but that would get Matoya obliterating me off the face of Aetheris. An incredibly Fantasia-inspired romp with a bippity-boppity-boo rendition of the Witch's classic theme, the Relic takes us through 3 distinct areas to gather the ingredients for our new familiar. We play pool with the Mudman, which is a cool puzzle in the fight, but is kind of a one-gimmick fight. Then it's off to the Waterworks and we fight the Nixie, who I think is possibly the best second boss in the entire game. Like, that fight has so many different mechanics, it has its own gigantic spectacle phase. It would have been an exceptional third boss, and it's just a second one. Then, we have to stop off at Tie-Dye Lavaland, and we get to have a showdown shortly afterwards with our creation, who, naturally in this ridiculous dungeon, is a literal flying pig. And you should never underestimate this pig. If your healer goes down to the giant inhaling attack, the damage is going to be way too high for anybody else to substitute in the healing. The Relic does sport a weakness that many dungeons up this high do, of pretty uninspired trash pulls, and its sheer variety of encounters and areas makes it kind of a struggle to feel cohesive, but honestly, none of that stops this dungeon from being fun. We're in the top third after all. Flex says, this is the remake that was perfect. Aubert said Nixie is a blessing to this game. My song said Fantasia the Dungeon. Yeah, this is just that lighthearted fantasy done so dang well. Uh, 24. The Tower of Babil. Endwalker's Tower of Babil is not quite what you expect out of a dungeon named for an FF4 dungeon, but unlike a certain other rug pull, I think it's doing its own thing well enough and distinctive enough that it has earned that right. The dungeon is not the most impressive visually, which is strange for Endwalker, mostly because the dark lighting makes it really hard to appreciate the architecture, and it doesn't get super interesting until you start getting into the organic mixing on the higher floors as you go up. Its trash is not the most exciting thing in the world, though it does get a bit of spice in terms of difficulty and the elevator segment, and you do get a little bit of fighting along NPC allies, which is always fun. What actually carries Babil for me are the boss fights. In true tower fashion, Dr. Legay is here to be a problem, and the fights with him and Barnabas are a blast. And I love the joke that he treats himself as super important despite existing only in this dungeon. That's some mirroring of the classics. But the real set piece is the end fight, which is maybe my favorite final dungeon boss in the game, Anima. It's said that Endwalker was once scheduled to be 2 expansions, and so Anima was likely once upon a time going to be a full-fledged trial. And frankly, it almost still is. It's got a ton of different attacks, it's an entire, phase transition and second form that you fight through. It's absolutely just one of the wildest dungeon bosses in the game. And it is absolutely the strength of those boss fights that elevates Babil. But it's not like it would be bad without. It would still place fairly averagely if it just had average bosses, because everything else is still solid. Fire Lamplight said, yeah, that boss feels like a trial. Spines everywhere. Oh, Bear, the music plot and Anima showing up here instead of later was a hell of a shock. Yeah, we were sold on the idea that Anima was going to be one of the trial fights. And having it be just the final boss of the second dungeon of Endwalk was like, oh god, what the hell? We had no idea what we were in for. 23. Pharaoh Sirius? In revisiting Sirius for this ranking, I got a whole new appreciation for it. The climb up the lighthouse has some fantastic visual sense of scale to it, using the clash of dark and light to create a great looking area for ARR standards. And it's one of the earliest dungeons to have a full music track. But what actually has it here is the quality of its boss fights. I'm not counting the Tyrant here, that's a trash pull. Nor am I fully counting the Zoo. I think it's pretty dumb to have a boss that basically instant kills the party if there's a dancer, but the chaos is at least interesting. Siren is a fairly varied boss, but the 2 things that really knocked this out of the park. The first is the trash pulls. Zombies, explosive environmental threats, big slow spells you want to interrupt, explosive gas valves you need to close. It is a dungeon that is constantly keeping you around. And then there's the Captain. The Captain's adds are summoned based on HP thresholds. Those adds need to be dealt with quickly so they don't stack up an exploding debuff. Because it is HP threshold based, they are summoned so much faster these days, and it becomes a chaotic fight that can go wrong so fast. As far as 2.x goes, this place is winning awards for its first boss and its trash pulls because they're nuts. They're really, really good and chaotic and fun. Not just by 2.x's standards, but just in general. And it's those really high aspects that help Pharaoh Sirius soar this high up with a total of 24 out of 35. I've gotten a whole new respect for it. It's just one of the best ARR dungeons to me in terms of actual gameplay challenge. Lou, she said, Pharaoh Sirius music was so good it made the devs start looping dungeon music permanently. Fun fact, originally it had the ARR music curse. It didn't loop. But then this is the one time they have gone back and actually retroactively extended a track. Soken just decided he liked the bass track so much that he did it. Lots of people being like, huh? Why is this so high? I was legitimately surprised that its total came out here too, but damn. 22. The Kitana Revel. If the Fractal Continuum was the most 3 out of 5 dungeon in the game, Kitana Revel is the most 4 out of 5 dungeon in the game. Which is to say, this journey through the Lost Ruins in the Jungle is an absolute banger with literally just one flaw limiting it from a potentially huge placement. Seriously, its trash is spicy enough, gaining note for the mini-bosses and the huge pulls you can do on top of them on the first leg, then just enough later to keep you busy. Its second boss is the infamous Bat Squatch, who puts healers through their paces and will surprise you with tricky-to-read AoEs. And its final boss is the Light Elemental Cerberus, who has a great variety of attacks and tricks up his sleeve that you need to pay attention to him at pretty much all times. And on a presentational site, like, I love the sights of the Revel. Even the cave segment, which is a bit weaker, has cave paintings and interesting structures dotted around if you look. And the music's unique instrumentation matches the feel it's going for, and just add an absolutely Indiana Jones feel. The weaknesses? Well, that's pretty much solely the first boss. He has one gimmick of lining up two different types of half-rune cleaves, and you just need to figure out the pizza slice. It's still okay-ish, but it's the weakest of Shadowbringers, because Shadowbringers has raised the boss quality bar so high. And that hit does drag this down some. This could have placed even higher. I love the Revel personally. This place is my jam. It's just personally one of my favorite places in Shadowbringers. Worst of demerit or no. Like, this is, by the way, this is the second to last time you will see a worst of demerit on this list. So that speaks to all of its other qualities. Oh, lots of mention of the fantastic gear here. Oh, my song, aesthetic's so good you go right back into it to talk about the lore. The last leg of the dungeon is so fun. Yeah, lots of love for this place. 21. The Siren Song C. Stormblood's opening number. As far as dungeons go, it's maybe the best the game has done at capturing the feeling of a haunted setting, which is both awesome and kind of sad that, like, Stormblood's possibly most memorable setting to me is so early, but, like, what do you expect out of a damn ship graveyard? I'm an FF5 nerd. It opens with you fighting off your boat, sadly without the NPC allies anymore. You come ashore, you fight your way through the horrors of the island with, like, all new boss mechanics coming in, basically, and all sorts of cool visuals and creepy designs. You cut through a cave and emerge in just the pouring rain. You go across a literal haunted ghost ship barraged by its cannon fire. All of this backed with a gloomy atmosphere, especially just in the music, which is nailing that haunted feeling so well. Now, I will say that despite the bosses each having unique tricks, they do rely on those tricks to be a little bit one note, and it does hold the Siren Song C back some. If its bosses were a little bit better, like, Siren Song C could be one of my favorite in the game, and I think what it is doing so damn well that it deserves to be up here. But Sage said, the crashing into the rocks is one of my favorite part of the game to date. Yeah, it's so good. Fire Lamplight said, look, I only get to experience weather in video games, not real life. Yeah, I probably am a little bit biased because the Pirate Graveyard from FF5, but, like, as it is, just barely whiffing the top 20. But speaking of the top 20, let's kick that off. The Etherochemical Research Facility. We kick off the top 20 with the big climactic dungeon of Heavensward and the second best dungeon of that expansion. It's a final dungeon, alright. The elegant aesthetic is at its strongest and most varied as we traverse the expansive testing facilities and eventually descend down through an abstracted space that forms up in front of us, inviting us to what is the most JRPG final boss looking room, I think, in the game. Like, it just has that feel to it. We get a variety of trash here in ambush and elevator patterns, though it's not the most exciting. Admittedly, the first two bosses are a bit of weak spots. I actually really don't like the regular Van Hydra's fight at all. It's boring and irritating, especially for any melee player. Harmachis borrows the mechanics of second coil raids, which is cute, but has to be confusing for anybody who's never been there, and it's over pretty fast these days. Those weaker bosses are ballooned up by the remade dual boss fight that is La Habrea Igiorum, and then their Dragon Ball Z Fusion Ha, which is a surprisingly intense duel if you haven't been there recently, because it did get completely reworked, and it's awesome now. Through it all, you're accompanied by a fully energetic rendition of Heavensward theme and treated to all sorts of just really cool and varied environmental design that shows off how much the 14 team could do with sci-fi settings. Still, even if it's at number 20, it is the weakest of the final dungeons to me. Just not necessarily by much. We're in the top 20 after all, and the others literally cannot be that far away. '19. The Fell Court of Troya. Our first true foray into the void, in the aftermath of Endwalker, would be difficult to improve to me. Well, outside the Endwalker bad habit of having really forgettable trash. The sometimes literally twisted and distorted castle is honestly gorgeous, and the view from the rooftops in the last set is particularly stunning, even if it's a little eerie, and that's the point. It's all augmented by an elegant rendition of Troya's theme from FF4 that adds to the surreal beauty of it all. And it doesn't disappoint on its bosses either. I actually enjoyed the various waves that make up the first boss, given their habit of mixing in huge AoEs as you fight the Horde. Lady Beatrice has fun tricks up her sleeve, and is a boss with decent variety and big explosive attacks. And then of course we get to the roof and we get our big battle with Scarmiglione, and who has like wall-destroying attacks, zombie summoning, claustrophobic AoE patterns. It all adds up to its own little mini-trial and is a lot of fun and a great kickoff to the Four Fiends story. And those big highlights more than make up for the weaknesses in the trash to me. Troya is overall fantastic, and while I don't have much to say in specific about it, just look at it. Tell me I'm wrong though when I say that this place is, like, really cool to look at. I don't even know this sort of dark architecture was my jam, but, like, yeah. Fire Lamplight said, I love this place and the atmospheric storytelling here. Yeah, it's so good. And the statues by the throne room. Yeah, just... there's so much here that's so good. Sage said, this place is one of my favorites. The competition's getting tough. Yeah. I popped off so hard when Scarmiglione took the stage and the music kicked in. Yep. I thought this was a little bit meh when I ran it at first, but I think every time I run it, I come to like it a little more. 18. Alamigo. Stormblood's third best dungeon, and its climactic finale. I told you it wouldn't take long to start seeing more final dungeons. This is a full-on battleground, set to a very strong track that carries the weight of the battle, and backed by tons of voice acting throughout, it achieves almost everything this climax needed on the audio front. Then, you get all the barricades, Imperial soldiers and tech, the extensions of the battle going on just outside your view, the idea that this battle for liberation, is going on all around you is almost realized, but has been done slightly better in a couple dungeons since. Alamigo is also blessed with solid trash pulls, with no leg going over without some sort of gimmick. Then you get some fun boss fights. The locking AoEs of the Scorpion, the soul extraction of Olus, a gimmick that's a little bit easier these days, but is still distinctive and memorable. And of course, the showdown with Stormblood's antagonist at the end. One that's cool, but revisiting it, I feel like they slowed down the pacing of the attacks a little bit. I could be wrong about that, but it feels that way. Still, it's a very solid gameplay lineup. The one thing that actually weighs this down for me is the presentation and the visual environments. I'll be honest, it's just not that exciting of architecture to me. It's it doesn't even feel quite like a lot of the visual design of the area has the same level of battle of Doma Castle, and Alamigan architecture just doesn't really sell it for me. I don't know. It's a pretty big climax to the story. It's a lot of fun to run. It's a very big moment. I do think the wartime theme that it was going for has just been done a little bit better since, and it has weakened Alamigo a bit in response. Oh, my song said, Xenos can glitch out at the end. If you die earlier than your party, make your way back to the barrier, then your party dies. Xenos will literally pursue the first person to the barrier? Amazing. Bear said, easily swapped with Doma for me. Huh. Yeah, that's alright. Number 17. The the Praetorium. Tell me, for whom do you fight? Listen, ARR's endgame would have placed much lower on the list. But then it got so much better. The update, frankly, the complete remake, culled a huge amount of filler, moved the Ultima weapon to its own trial, buffed up the other bosses, and it makes the excuse to pop open YouTube even better. And hey, like I said for Castrum, I'm not penalizing this for the cutscene length. You hit main scenario roulette, you knew what you were signing up for. In fact, the fact this place is a big story deal is a big part of how it scores this high. I mean, there's a lot of Garlean places for it to compete with, but this is the Garlean fortress. And if you've been playing long enough, you know at least part of Gaius' iconic speech. The vistas are actually pretty solid too, and Penitus, the music track, is low-key one of my favorite tracks in the entire game, even 10 years later. This place just kind of presentationally blows everything else in launch ARR out of the water. On the gameplay front, it's also not the worst. You have the whole Magitech riding segment, which is simple but fun, because you keep moving throughout it, and you literally don't have a third trash leg, so that's great. It's literally just the bosses holding it back, and it's not that they aren't trying, it's just that they're tuned for ARR levels of complexity. But there's a lot going on here that you're not used to in ARR in terms of extra effort, and all those awards it ends up winning as the best of the launch dungeons shoves it up this high. This dungeon is a crazy good experience compared to everything that came before it in ARR, and is a good, it's a good foreshadowing for players to have this moment of oh, this is how good the game can get. This current iteration, I think, earns this spot as ARR's third best overall dungeon. Oh, my song, gosh, the rework makes me so happy. Cecil, the only thing I miss about the rework is Maggie looking at us through a robot eyes. Fair. I cleaned my apartment many a time during the original. And yes, if you missed it, I am talking about the dungeons as they currently are, not as they were. Because you can't go back and play the old 8-man slogfest that was the original Praetorium. 16. Alzadal's Legacy. These next 3 dungeons all share a very similar set of traits. They all scored the exact same total and without a single best of award. The quality is insanely high now. In the aftermath of Endwalker, Alzadal's Legacy was a return to basics, a treasure map leading us to a lost island, discovering a hidden temple, fighting its guardians in search of whatever forbidden treasures locked away, and I think it nails that adventure feeling and progression. It's kind of what I think Scala wishes it was. The weakness is that most of its combat factors are just pretty good. Not bad. Even its trash has some surprisingly good variety for Endwalker, especially with the summoning gates. The first couple bosses are fairly solid, with maybe being a little bit one-trick, but some big attacks you do need to pay attention to. And it has a really fun final boss in Kapakulu, who sends you spinning around the arena with messed up controls, dodging spikes and his giant cleaves. Great final bosses is kind of the Endwalker standard, but yeah. All of this is accompanied by an incredible progression of scenery and details, and an adventurous music track that just nails it. Like, I didn't give this dungeon much of a second thought at the time, but when I came back with an honest eye towards this place's quality, I fell in love with this place. It's an awesome dungeon. The fact that the worst parts of this are still a 3 out of 5 just shows how high quality we are getting here. Oh, my song. Love the security system popping off on you from the very beginning. Yeah. Love you, Thavnair. A mechanic so good, it's in Fall Guys. Yep. Number 15. Mount Gulg. I won't lie, it initially disappointed me a bit by not really doing anything to reference the classic FF location in anything but name, but once again, this establishes itself well enough that it didn't need it. To climb up the giant Talos to a floating mountain being mutated into a divine sanctuary is done really well. The individual styles visually are not super impressive, but the way that it evolves over the course of the place does elevate it. Plus, you get a really driving theme, and as you near the top, Va3's panicked voice augments it all. It helps that Gulg has great trash too. You get mini-bosses in the second and third wave, and if you weren't aware, you can pull the entire first leg of the dungeon for possibly the single spiciest trash pull in the game, outside of, like, trying to pull the entirety of Ormvale's opening room, you fool. You also get pretty solid bosses. The first two are maybe a little bit simple, but still solid and fun. Like, the Forbidden Rubik's Cube is easy once you solve it, but you do have to solve it. And of course, Forgiven Obscenity in the end with her various visual tricks is fun, though I do kind of wish the fight pace wasn't broken up by her going untargetable so much. All in all, not really a single major weak point to Mount Gulg, just the good parts and the really good parts. It's not so much a personal favorite, but I can't pretend it's anything other than awesome. Oh, my song. All the people built into Va3's architecture is just, what a thematic and gross way to bring all these themes to head. Literally built on the backs of the people. Yeah, it's so cool. Love that last boss here in the architecture. Yep, so good. Number 14. The Tower of Zot. Once again, an opening dungeon for an expansion makes a crazy big splash by upping the standard, and Endwalker's Tower of Zot was the strongest opening number of them all to me. To say that the Gigarian Nightmare Tower with a vaguely FF4 inspiration left an impression is to put it lightly. What really sells Zot above anything else, and I think needs to focus the discussion, is the insanely high boss quality. The Magus Sisters are a centerpiece here. You get the fight with Minerva, who litters the battlefield with a variety of chaotically disjointed AoEs, and keeps your healers busy with dots. Then, you get Senderva, who's slightly less impressive, relying on a stun mechanic and the confused duplicates, which is a gimmick that's reasonable to get a hold of, but it's still fun and pays snappy enough to make you pay attention quickly. And then, of course, at the roof, you get to fight the entire trio in the most chaotic, just oppressive mess of AoEs that is just absolutely one of the most intense final dungeon bosses in the game, and absolutely crazy for a dungeon. It's all backed by great presentation, too. The bio-horror nature of the tower adds a unique and memorable setting. The remix of the classic FF4 theme is not a perfect choice for me, but I do think it adds a lot of tension. The weakness Zot falls prey to is, the Endwalker weakness. The trash is okay. I mean, it has some bite, and you can pull kind of big. But other than that, if it could overcome that weakness, it could place higher. But really, Zot does a great job setting up the expectation for Endwalker's dungeons. Excellent presentation and crazy good boss fights are what it was here for. Aubert said, the final boss is a hot mess. Affectionate. Yes. Oh, my son. First they were flowers, then they were bugs, now they are beasts. Yep. Zod I would swap with Babil. Though Zod and the Mega Sisters are good. Fair enough. Cecil said, I remember the first time I ran this dungeon. I tanked it, pulled too much while mitigating too little, and got my world rocked. Yep. 13. I think you've all been waiting for this one. The Tamtara Deepcroft Hard Mode. The second best dungeon in all of ARR. One of the top 20 dungeons in a game with 90 is the hard mode revisit of the single worst dungeon in the game. Show me a better glow up. Following up on a side tragedy you might have forgotten about, the return to the Deepcroft isn't just random cultists anymore. It's an old acquaintance driven mad by grief, turning the place into a necromantic lair where she's trying to revive her dead abusive boyfriend. And wouldn't you know it, you've been invited because your body would be just perfect. And the Deepcroft leans into that horror. Darker ambience, enemy selection, even the NPCs that were formerly her party are involved in the boss fights, with Leavine tricking you in how you need to handle the fight by ignoring the ads, and then you needing to protect Pio Rayo in a pretty unique encounter, honestly. And then of course you have Edda, where on top of dealing with the half-revived form of Avir as a demon, you need to keep the monsters from reaching Edda at the same time so her massive attack doesn't wipe you out. And you, all the while, hearing her echoing, sad laugh, which caps off the extended version of the Tamtara theme that leans into, like, Japanese horror instrumentation. Like, this dungeon blew me away in ARR at the time. It's a little dated now, but also, I still love so much about it. Surprisingly, it's not even my pick for the best of from ARR, but it's still up here at 13. I think this is just one of the most memorable dungeons in the game. Oh, my song said, wish the game did more side stories like this. Yeah, this is the only one that really leans into a horror theme. Oh, my song. This place is the equivalent of a mad scientist mixing together potions and then blowing the entire place up and then laughing maniacally about how it worked perfectly. Yeah? The lore. Yes, the lore. I did this place at 3 in the morning when I first did it, by the way. I was not ready for the cutscene afterwards. 12. The Gimlet Dark. This is the second best offering Stormblood gave us. This is the Warzone Alamigo kind of wishes it was, and I do mean Warzone. This is a straight-up trench warfare dungeon, where the melodies of Stormblood, Garlemald, and the Alamigan Anthem battle it out in an emotional piece as you push across the battlefield. And unlike Alamigo, it's not just your own battle where the soldiers are around you on the outside. You are frequently joined by the allies you've made as NPCs, who will help you blow up the many notable foes you face between bosses, and that evolution is the big step up I was talking about that Alamigo missed. There's even a segment at the end where a random ally gets to limit break to help you out. What does hinder the Dark a little bit is that its first couple bosses are just alright. You'd be forgiven for having forgotten yet another Magitech Colossus, even if it's fun, and Prometheus is an alright fight that maybe has a little much downtime. It's the final boss, with Anya and Julia, that people remember. The combo battle with 2 Garlean officers, where they literally pull off dual techs against you and then, like, high-five each other in the middle of the fight. That's so unnecessary and cool. But even still, those weaker bosses can't stop the fact that the Gimlet Dark is intense. The wreckage and explosions, the enemies literally parachuting in. It's not going to be everybody's favorite scenario or aesthetic, but in an expansion all about war, the Gimlet Dark provides a more modern sense of what war looks like that still manages to be thematically fantasy, and that's a difficult balance to strike, and I really respect it for that. Oh, my song said, this dungeon set a precedent for the rest of the game, IMO. Allies coming together to help you. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Bear, I think that what weakens this is that we already got Dome and Alamigo with similar vibes. Yeah, I think it weakens it on impression, but in judging it, like, retroactively, I think it just, like, you realize this is kind of what they wanted to be done better. It just wasn't as new at the time. Anyway, just barely missing the top 10 is a kind of similar dungeon. Pagelthan, aka the Gimlet Tart 2, Shadowbringer's Boogaloo. I won't say that Pagelthan starts off quite as impressive immediately. On actually presentational fronts, I think it's mostly a bit worse. The stonework is stuff we have seen before. Most of the dungeon falls into it. Now, this is salvaged by an amazing third leg, where you board dragons and fly out into a battlefield on the sunset, and then are just, like, trashing through the battlefield, accompanied by literally massive dragons fighting on your side, all to have a showdown with Lunar Bahamut, which is a wildly big feeling fight. Like, damn. And the rest of the combat is a step up too, which is, like, it doesn't have weak first couple bosses. Amhaluk is a previous boss concept turned up as a callback to Coil's Indigood. Then we have the artillery wall, which is, like, a honestly really fun trash pull boss, because it does a lot to keep you on your toes while you fight through the trash. And, like, Lunar Bahamut may not be as impressive as raid level Bahamut, but it's one of the most explosive boss battles we get in a dungeon. I think you can make a strong case for this being one of the top 10 dungeons in the game, but for me it just slightly whiffs out. Also, it's kind of wild to me that we're still not Shadowbringer's top 3. Oh, my song. I love that this is coming to the age of the Amalja, the people who summoned the first primal you fought, and now you are coming to their aid. Real sign of how the things have progressed in the world. Oh yeah, absolutely. I hate this dungeon because its gear is amazing, but Square is mean and won't let me die at 0 out of 10. Understandable. But, after Pagelthan, we're at the top 10. Y'all ready? I wouldn't blame you for having lost track of what's still on the table for the best of the best. Number 10. The Vault. As a reminder, I am only counting what happens in the dungeon. The Vault still gets this spot anyway, as Heaven's Ward's best. The break into the Holy See of Ishgard is a turning point in the story for a lot of reasons. The cathedral is impossibly grand with an incredible sense of scale, and the distant and echoing organ track might be a little bit rote and expected, but it is exactly what this place wanted to match its identity. Plus, you get a special boss track at the end, and multiple bosses with voice acting, so that helps. Still, it's presentationally the weakest of the top 10 dungeons to me. Its golden aesthetic blending together may be a little bit much. Does this stop it from being good? No, because the Vault is delivering on its bosses way ahead of its time. Each of them are dynamic and exciting fights. The first is maybe not the wildest thing ever, and yes, Grenaud's been nerfed a little bit, the rifts don't stay around as long, but he will still obliterate players who aren't paying attention. And speaking of obliterating players, Ser Charibert at the top. Whew. Yeah, you get the introduction of the various mechanics he has in the first phase, then you get an ad phase that, you know, so far it feels so pretty normal, and then he whips out everything and starts layering it over top of each other and just demolishes everything. Any player who has not fully understood the fight at that point is going to get dunked, and you'd better pray it's not your healer. It's easily one of the dungeon bosses I most see players struggle with. And that's what really makes the Vault for me. At a time where bosses were getting better, but still weren't too crazy, the Vault is batting way above its weight class with 2 Best of awards. That it all comes together in a unique setting in the game, done super well, just seals the deal, and it can't stop the Vault's weak points from keeping it out of the top 10. I like that the gold is brought on by the sunset. Also the chess motif beginning. Oh yeah. Those particle effects back then, roast your laptop? Yep. Cecil said, I always love queuing into this with first-time players and saying, enjoy the cutscene after the run. It's what you do. Number 9. The Lost City of Amdapor is maybe personal bias, but this dungeon blew me away and is Realm Reborn's shining star. From the moment you enter the Lost City, you're beset with a feeling of melancholy. With the fungal growths everywhere, this place should be disgusting, but the longing music and the dusty air gives it this sad beauty. It blows the rest of ARR out of the water with its presentation, and is still honestly one of my personal favorite locations in the game, even though its muted palette should penalize it like so many others. Now, it is that incredible ambience and presentation that makes the Lost City place this high, and the fantastic variety of trash pulls with all sorts of gimmicks like environmental hazards covering mobs, like the goblins who debuff you that you have to cleanse with an emote. It's a shame the bosses are a weaker point. The Gourmand is a quick tank and spank, Ariok has a cute gimmick where you get aggro by letting the tank kill its ads, which is neat, but that's all there is to it. Only Diablos really stands up as all that notable. And while you skip his mechanics now, usually, instead of solving the door puzzle, it does actually add some threat to the fight because he ramps up his damage as you're not supposed to be skipping that. If it had better bosses, the Lost City could be a top 3 dungeon to me. It has all the rest of the pieces sorted out, way ahead of the Realm Reborn curve. On a personal level, this is in competition for like my favorite in the game, possibly. And maybe my bias is affecting these numbers, but like, damn. Fire Lamplight. Oh yes, trying to pull on those stairs was challenging back then and not knowing the last mechanics on the fight. Yep. Absolutely not surprised by this one. I've known your love of Lost City. Yeah. Ah yes, I get a little itchy when I look at all that pollen. Okay. Number 8. Anamnesis Anator. The journey beneath the waves to an ancient facility of memories is not one that would immediately seem all that special, but as you go, you realize that everything about this dungeon is nailing it. Trash pulls? You get the strange beast coming at you on Bismarck's back, then you get the summoners to damage race as a fun challenge. Bosses? You fight a giant subaquatic Tyrannosaurus Rex thing, which is blasting huge lasers with unique mechanisms, and then a second one shows up out of hecking nowhere. Later, Kyclops brings back the good old giant enemy archetype, and then we enter the facility proper beneath the waves. And yes, at this point, Amarotine environments are almost familiar to us. But there we fight Rook Shodi. It seems silly to be fighting a Sahagan Queen here, but then you get a mechanic where you have to get knocked onto vents in order to stop ads from spawning, and you're like, wait a second, this is Sastasha. Even the music here is born from Sastasha. This is how far the game has come. That some of the core ideas of the ambience and pieces of Sastasha, almost, can be completely revisited and reimagined, and that the quality of this game has just gotten so high at this point. Like, I don't know. Something about Anamnesis, it is just firing on all cylinders while making you appreciate just how far you have come. Cecil Hoshino mentioned, and then it hits that Amaro jazz. Yep. Oh, my song. I literally never put it together until a few seconds before you said it. Holy crap. Yep. Sage said, I think you undervalued the bosses here, but I respect its placement. Okay. I mean, it's a 5-3-4. Not much higher I could value. But, number 6. Is it number 6? Number 7? Number 7. I had that one moved at some point. Anyway, Ktisis Hyperborea. As a reminder, I am not counting who you get for duty support. If you know, you know. Ktisis earns this spot all on its own. The hyperdimensional testing ground of creation is Endwalker's third best dungeon and earns its spot easily. Its presentation is immaculate. Every vista is incredible, whether you're down on the environmental zones on the ground, up in the labs, or ascending into the sky to look down upon the works. The music track is soaring and engaging, and of course you have voice acting to top the audio experience. And, like, conceptually and as an identity, it's the Garden of Goddamn Eden. Like, even the structure of heading steadily skywards fits the theme of this place and its builders and the way they think about life. Propping up that perfected presentation are some great bosses. Lissa's alright, with okay attacks and a cute vanishing in the snow trick. There's the stronger second boss in the Ladon Lord, who mixes a variety of attacks with the giant rune cleaves. And of course, given that the final boss of is a showdown with Hermes, it's as good as it should be. The attacks are surprisingly complex and punishing for a dungeon boss, and players not on their A game can easily get demolished here. It's a lot of fun for a fight. The single thing holding Ktisis back from being a top 3 contenders is the Endwalker curse of just not doing trash very well. But it is so damn near perfect in every other way that can't hold Ktisis back. It earns its place here in the top 10 as Endwalker's third best dungeon. Sage said, you put one of my top 3 at 7. Respectable. Flux said, honestly, this is probably my most favorite dungeon. I absolutely understand people who would say this is their number 1. Like, we are almost at splitting hairs here for these top ranks. Number 6. The Hero's Gauntlet. So, I'll make my case first that this dungeon does have a weakness. Being literally built out of the pieces of the field maps limit exactly how visually appealing and exciting I think this dungeon could be. It's a weakness I've never been all that environmentally impressed with it. And I will now shut up my critical side because everything else is goddamn nailing it. This is another one of those big battle scenarios, but is pretty wild as we literally retrace our steps for the finale of the story of Norvant. We're fighting literally alongside allies and even former boss fights as we face off against Heroes of Light, not just flavoring the trash pulls with familiar mechanics, but bringing back job concepts that haven't actually been in 14 as playable as bosses, each of which brings their own fun and interesting mechanics to the table. Especially, I love the Berserker's massive cleaves and slams that are literally deforming the terrain as you fight. Like, that's so cool. And it's all set to a really high-energy, driving medley of themes from your journey. It's not quite perfect, but the Gauntlet's a great trip down memory lane with its own new spice, and makes sense as the start of our farewell to the expansion. I wouldn't be surprised to see this one compete for even higher spots on many players' list, because it makes a point to be a big event, and it is. It's Shadowbringer's third best dungeon for a reason. Necromancer class in general, when? Aubert, I would argue the dungeon we're using previous areas as a strength to tie everything together. I would largely agree, but not necessarily visually, if that makes any sense. It helps the identity of the dungeon, but not so much the visuals. This dungeon is literally bigger than the sum of its parts. Yeah. And speaking of the best, we begin the top 5 with a dungeon I don't think anybody has even realized isn't on this list yet. The Swallow's Compass. I said before that there were certain dungeons I was surprised placed as high as they did once I scored them. And nothing blew me away quite like the Swallow's Compass on the scores. The Temple to Geomancy, the job Square Enix should frankly just give us already, goddammit, is a 3-leg journey through the elements of earth, water, and wind, and it pervades the dungeon, giving each section a unique flavor while constantly tying it back. The first leg, we get to fight through the elemental summonings, eventually opening the door and fighting the Tengu. His spinning fireballs are a singular gimmick, but a unique and distinctive one that keeps the fight dynamic. Partially due to Stormblood's low bar for the first bosses, it's the expansion's best. Then, we travel through the water segment, and we get the really unique trash pulls where we are getting shoved around by the world's funniest blue mage skill all the time. Then we fight Daidara Bachi, affectionately known as Bongo Cat, who is a big and almost entirely visual boss. Yes, he shows up like a mini-boss and stuff later in other stuff, but that's one of those cases where it's like, oh yeah, this design was just so solid, we're going to bring it back wholesale. Like, it's a great, fun fight. And then, of course, we scale to the top of the mountain, and we get to fight legally distinct Goku, by which I mean Sun Wukong, who teaches us his various attacks, goes through an ad phase, and then goes, okay, but what if my attacks from 2 of me, and spices it up? The entire time, you get a gorgeous rendition of Yancha's theme, fantastic sights in all direction, solid trash variety. I'm a bit surprised it scored this high too, but, like, this completely optional dungeon with little lore weight was kind of nailing it. It's the best dungeon in Stormblood to me, and according to these scores, the 5th best dungeon in the game. Well, my song said top 5 for me too. Fire Lamplight, I farm this for glamour a lot. It's just Eastern Astral, I will fight you in the street. Number 4. The Twinning. Imagine this. You've just finished up the emotional roller coaster and awe-inspiring fights of Shadowbringers. The story's hit its climax and you're ready to go relax. But hey, you're level capped now, might as well unlock the new dungeons. Oh, this dungeon takes place in the Crystal Tower, you say, unaware of the fact that the moment you step in, you're getting slapped in the face with a complete banger. And I'm not just talking about the music, although A Long Fall might be the most well-known dungeon theme in the entire game at this point. No, I'm talking about the fact this dungeon, that frankly did not need to go this hard, is firing on every cylinder. The Twinning places 4th in score without a single Best of award to its name, the highest dungeon to do so. If you were not to add those modifiers to those other dungeons, this would be 2nd. The dungeon does an immaculate fusion of the Crystal Tower's fantastic aesthetics with a sci-fi overhaul that tells just as much of a story about what happened here as the lore tidbits do. And along the way we get 3 great bosses. The Alpha Zagnal's AoEs are familiar, but less familiar is the way that you have to keep them from smashing open the containers and freeing ads. Mithridates pesters you with increasingly claustrophobic crisscrossing AoEs and personal attacks, and then of course, the Tycoon is literally Ironworks Alexander, freezing his attacks in time as they start, and forcing you to keep in mind as you dodge other attacks. All while surrounded by glimpses of the time that was lost. Like, I just can't stress enough how good this dungeon is. Its one weak point is that its trash is just okay, but it still uses enough enemies with notable AoEs thanks to Hydras and Chimeras and stuff to be still okay. And the thing that I want to stress is that the Twinning didn't need to be this good. The story's wrapped up, the climax has happened. This was a dungeon made for grinding and expert roulette, less for impact, and yet it's still one of the most memorable dungeons in the game. It has damn well earned its 4th place, and is Shadowbringer's 2nd best. Yoshi said, Twinning? More like winning. Falcio, the lore blurbs as we travel the Twinning gives more insight into just how long a shot they were taking. Obear, the dance is playing in my head rent-free now. Yeah, this place is just so good. Number 3. The Itioscope. The second to last dungeon of Endwalker's main story, and its 2nd best dungeon. But you'd be forgiven if you thought this was the last dungeon of Endwalker, because this descent into the ethereal sea and its increasingly crystalline focus absolutely screams last dungeon, especially when it's filled with the spirits of past foes and fallen allies alike. Those allies lend the Aetioscope's trash a lot of color that Endwalker otherwise tended to lack. Various buffs, attack spells, notable enemies, all of it spices up the trash pulls and makes it the expansion's best, even if it's not stellar on that front. Like, it wasn't a hard bar to clear, but still. And the foes, they clear it too, whether it's the minor enemy showdown with Mr. Sloppy or the monstrous raging slows of foes you've nearly forgotten by now. Those reimagined battles with Livia and Ridditon are great fights. I especially like Ridditon's, like, getting to do so much more with his shields, deforming the very earth and stuff as you fight him. It's super cool. All of this is accompanied by a stellar environmental design that screams Final Fantasy's signature crystalline aesthetic. And the music is fantastic. So often the dungeons use rearrange of the motifs of the zones they're linked to. The Aetioscope does, but you'd be forgiven for not realizing the intensely dramatic and emotive piece for this dungeon is Labyrinthos' goofy melody. I wonder which was composed first. Where the Aetioscope does stumble and only drop to third place, and I say only third place like it's a bad thing, is that its last leg is a little weak. The dulling aesthetic makes a bit of sense with the lore, but it's not as interesting to look at, and yes, there is a big emotional surprise in the middle of the fight with how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man. But outside of that surprise, the fight's actually just fine. It's not as creative and memorable as its contemporaries. But that's like it. The Aetioscope is a great journey down memory lane, but uses that design to inspire a very solid dungeon experience that I think stands up even on replay. If it was just cheap emotional pulls, I don't think it would stand the test of time. I'm not going to read some of the comments on this one. Mostly because most of them are naming specific spoiler stuff, but I will say I'm surprised to hear some of the hate for this, but like, I'm kind of curious. It was a dungeon I didn't think too much of my first time. I was like, yeah, that's pretty good, but that's probably not going to last. And then I did it again, and I'm like, oh, no, actually it did last. Number 2. Amaro. I feel like people may be mad that this is only in second, and I will explain shortly, I promise. Shadowbringers' final dungeon has us reliving the fall of Amaro, the nightmarish final days of an ancient civilization. The majestic city crumbles around us, monsters spawn into existence on the street as we run, and the game's antagonist, Emmett Salk, narrates the nightmare that haunts him as we go. It's such a powerful piece of story lived through the game, detailed even down to the name of the locations we pass telling their own story. Oh, and we get one of the coolest first bosses ever in the first beast, a boss whose destructive raining meteors literally bring down the wall of nearby buildings, crashing as gigantic AoEs. Then we're invited to see the end of the world, and boy, do we. Almost every new player stops to take in the view as we arrive in the skies above the planet, and maybe the single most amazing sight in the entire game. It's like the Day of Lavos up in this. Then, of course, we fight the nightmare that we've been seeing constantly. Therion is fought on a platform that grows smaller and smaller, its safe spots from his giant beams steadily crumbling away, and advancing doom mirroring the calamity that's facing the planet. Many of his attacks simply cannot be avoided fully, and you must do your best to escape and treat the damage. It's great. Amaro wins 4 best ups for its already insane extension. Best first boss, best visuals, best audio, best identity. So how is it not the first? 2 words, Terminus goddamn Bellwether. The second boss is a complete embarrassment. I'm sorry. Yes, being swarmed with a ton of ads makes sense thematically for the tale, but it is also literally a boss that's just a gigantic pile of trash mobs and then a little enrage. Absolute garbage, worst of the expansion, and embarrassingly the highest placing 0 on a scorecard. It's still not enough to keep Amaro from being Shadowbringer's best dungeon, and the second best dungeon in the game, but like, in ranking it, it does single-handedly prevent it from having had a shot in the first place. Which, you might have figured by now, goes to the Dead Ends. Last expansion, we witnessed the end of a civilization. How could Endwalker have topped that? Witnessing the despair of the universe itself as entire worlds fall. First, we pay visit to an oceanic planet infected by a horrid plague. Its land soak in ictor, its lives deformed and driven to madness in their death throes, slaughtering each other as the very world succumbs. There, we fight a beast whose control of the wind spreads the toxin, dooming us if we cannot navigate thin, safe paths through the gales. Then, it's off to a world that reached great technological advancement, only to tear itself apart in a rebellion against an oppressive regime. On a field bombarded constantly by missiles, we cut our way across and fight a vehicle of war, one armed to the teeth with enough firepower to destroy a city, covering the battlefield in an intense and chaotic barrage of explosions and laser beams that makes for maybe one of the most intense dungeon bosses in the entire game. And, if you stick around, you can watch a man order the destruction of his world and face the horror of what he is doing as it happens in front of him. Then, finally, we come unto paradise itself, the land where all of its people's woes were remedied, where no sorrow or joy ever existed again. They created their own bringer of death, Ra-La, and there we fight it. Its graceful bounds and gentle imagery are savagely punishing despite itself, and will demolish any player who doesn't respect it. All of this, while accompanied by one of the most incredible tracks in the game, a grandiose piece full of emotion that subtly works in the classic Final Fantasy prelude in the best way, and is accompanied by Medion's own narration telling us the stories of these worlds. All this surrounded by some of my favorite visual landscapes in the game. The Dead Ends is near perfect to me. The single worst score it has is a 3 out of 5 for trash, which is still a solid score and well above Endwalker's standard. And the rest is perfection. I have no issues with anything else in it. It has two of the best bosses in Endwalker in their slots, which is a heavy competition. It has the best visual and audio experience to me. It takes stuff as crazy as the Stigma Dreamscape to steal away its Identity Award, and bosses like Anima to steal away its Final Boss Award. Its final score is 37 out of 35 because of those awards. To me, it deserves its spot as the game's best dungeon, and until we get a literally perfect dungeon, it's probably going to stay there. Oh, my song. I love how the final leg reflects the future of Amaro if it continued on its course. Oh, yeah, I know. That's so good. Flux, every time I go through this dungeon, I swear I learn something new. Yeah, that is the end of it. That is all of the dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV. At least, the dungeons in the dungeon tab, not counting all the spin-off stuff like deep dungeons, etc. Oh, buddy, that was a long recording of that one. I can't believe the amount of time that I spent on this ranking video. It's no wonder there are so many people who make their living editing videos professionally on YouTube. Maybe in another timeline I actually just captured a bunch of footage and paid an editor to prepare it from my, single audio recording. Anyway, this isn't the only ranking video I'll be doing, but, it'll be the only one for tonight. Next up, I plan to tackle the Alliance raids, which will be drastically shorter, probably. I'm not sure if I'm going to do, the Alliance raid as a whole, or do, just a ranking the 60 bosses in the Alliance raid. But that'll be the next one and will certainly be quicker to research for. And then after that, I also want to do this, but for the trials and raids in normal difficulty. And mixing them together, because they're all the 8-man boss fights. And I love the boss fights in this game. Still, I want to get a suite of these done before Dawn Trails release and we end up with even more content. So, yeah. Thanks for listening, and have a good day. Don't say like and subscribe. Don't do it. Have a good day or night or whatever. Time's an illusion anyway.